The castle gates posed no barrier to their entry as Orem and Kinro climbed to the foot of Brokewrist Castle. One door had fallen aside, leaving gaps not unlike a battered grin. The locals had purloined the best stones from the curtain wall that surrounded the castle, leaving low runs that could have been climbed with relative ease. Vines choked the walls and small bushes burst from the base of the wall. Many seasons of such growth had undermined what once would have been a formidable defense. Now it was a sorrow-racked derelict, holding on to little more than sour memories. The keep beyond was 3 stories of dressed stone, with dark portals that looked out on the bailey blindly. Only the one window had light emanating from within, unwavering but thin and gauzy. The great arched doors of the keep stood some 10 feet tall, with heavy, scrolling stonework set above them, carved with cavorting animals and twisting faces. Flecks of paint clung in the recesses, whispering of the splendor that once was this squalid place. Orem fingered the ring on his hand and surveyed the broken tower, some 100 paces further down the yard. Heaps of rubble remained where it hadn't been carted off by opportunistic builders. The tower had collapsed from somewhere near its midpoint, dumping tons of stone and lumber onto the roof of the keep and into the yard. It was clear there was no longer access to the tower from the ground level. "You've been up in the keep?" Orem asked, looking up at the pale light in the highest windows. Ledges ran like bands round the face of the building, clearing marking out stories. Decorative engravings in the stonework now pooled shadows like sockets of a death mask. "Twice," said his companion, lighting up the steps. The hinges screeched as Kinro put his shoulder to them, forcing it slowly aside. Orem lent his strength too, and the door swung quickly aside. With a thunderous smash it crashed against the inner wall. The sound seemed to shiver in the very bones of the castle. Dust and stones fell from the shadows above. "Dreary," said Orem. "Did you close that door when you left?" "Not I," Kinro said, as he led the way deeper into the vaulted cavity of the keep's front hall. Stone steps twisted up to a balustrade above. There came the slightest noise from the depth ahead. Orem dropped into a half-squat, his hand moving to the leather-wrapped hilt of his sword. All was silent save the sifting of the dust that had been knocked free by their entrance. Despite the suffocating pause, Orem's fighting instincts told him something had passed in the gloom, on the very edge of his senses. Like a wolf at bay he waited, hand on hilt and ready to spring into action, his eyes glittering and livid. Kinro whirled, belt hissing a curse, and launching a silver missile towards the broken balcony that lined the stairs. Orem watched it impact the wall above the balustrade. Dashing into action, he bounded up the steps ahead of the smaller man, brave blade already fast in his fist. Nothing. He turned to face Kinro. "I felt the wind change," the little man said with a bow of his head. He scooped and picked up his knife, holding it for Orem to see. There, on the deadly edge, was a thin line of blood. Orem grunted, looking around him, trying to sense movement in the dark. "Something hunts us from the shadows," Kinro muttered with a warning gesture. "Good. Let us draw it out, if we can." They climbed higher in the castle, Kinro ahead and Orem with a wary eye on their backs. The floor had rotted out in many places, leaving dark abscesses that threatened to pitch them into the depths below. Kinro crouched beside one door and fished something out of the detritus. A child's doll with a wooden head fixed to a bag-like cloth body. It was spotted with flowers of dried brown blood. Orem tightened his grip on his sword until his knuckles popped. They filtered through the inner spaces like wraiths, but nothing else darted out or attacked them in their searching, though shadows moved and black wings flapped leathery wings from time to time. In all their searching, Orem saw no passage to the higher floor. He had supposed from the first that it would be a guarded, private quarters for the occupants of the keep. Their one way in was now blocked by many tons of rubble. They finished their prowling on the second floor, looking down through the windows at the broken front gate. Kinro rested his hand on the wooden hilt of his long curved sword. "You see," he said, The creature must wait above, yet I do not know the way." Orem rubbed his jaw. "I do," he said. Sheathing Brave Blade on his back, Orem turned to face the windows. He flicked his enormous shoulders and wound his thick arms about their sockets, limbering up. Then, with the certain but measured tread of a man well used to the winters of fear, he stepped up and onto the ledge of the window. Dozens of feet below, the cracked, weed-pocked flagging of the bailey lay cloaked in blue shadow. Faint starlight sharpened the hard edges of everything, casting a sharp and deadly aspect to the night. Orem glanced up. There was enough of a ledge that ran along the outside of the wall that, with care, he could move along, sliding 1 foot at a time. Steadily he moved 1 foot out over the edge, his heel hanging in the void, then another. Carefully he made his way along, fingers gripping the meagerest of gaps in the dressed stone above him. After he had moved a few feet, Kinro joined him. They crept across the ledge that way, each man's breathing as tense as a garret, sweat beading on their brows as they slithered along their inch-wide footing, hearts racing to betray the fear that their hard faces did not show. The corner of the building had been built such that alternating layers of stone jutted out slightly at this height, giving some hope of a foothold. Orem probed forward with one hand and foot, eager for the feeling of firm stone beneath his boots again. It was as he neared the corner that their foe struck. Sweeping out of the air, a cacophony of black wings and gleaming obsidian claws, a great bird slammed into Orem. Unable to let go of the wall, he bellowed a curse and tried to shake it free as the thing ripped at his back. His thin tunic was little protection against razor talons. Still, Orem did not let go. Having no other choice, he gathered his strength into his knees, preparing to leap backwards and grab the beast that ripped at him. He would carry it to hell. Hark! An upward stroke of silver. Orem heard it more than saw it, a rumor of starlight upon steady blade. The beast shrieked and fell toward the ground. Kinro did too. His free hand scrabbled for purchase on the wall, but the power of the slash had carried his feet too far into space. Kinro did not drop his sword as he plummeted backwards. Orem's hand shot out. With fingers of iron, he caught the front of Kinro's loose robes with one hand, and desperately clutched the wall with the fingertips of his other. "Heavy," he groaned. Kinro glanced around at the ground below him. A fall from that height to uneven stone would surely break his legs, or worse. "Do it, Orem," he said flatly. "No," Orem said. His control was slipping. All of his battle-won strength was precariously balanced. The long, lean whipcords of his arms stood out like snakes that writhed up into his neck. Kinro's free hand worked at Orem's fingers, trying to pry them free. "I am a petal on the wind," he chanted. "I fly and fall where the wind wills." As if summoned by this strange prayer, a harsh gust of cold breeze caught the side of the building. "Early graves are never ready," Orem grated. Then, with a savage roar so loud the dogs in the town below began barking a motley chorus, he heaved Kinro up, throwing him bodily at the ledge above them. Kinro disappeared into the dark window above. Free of his burden, Orem felt 10 times lighter. His muscles quivered with exhaustion, but he had more yet to give. Orem climbed up the overlapped cornering and climbed to the ledge himself. Kinro helped him back up and in. "You're back," he said as Orem staggered and caught himself against the wall. Though he longed to lie on the muddy tiled floor, Orem turned to look down at the bailey far below. "No corpse," he growled, ignoring his companion. "What is this thing that struck at us?" "A demon, surely, or some fell creature of the air." Kinro surveyed the room around him. He had not sheathed his sword, but held it before him with a double-fisted grip. "Demons don't bleed," Orem said. "I think it's a man of some sort." He unsheathed Brave Blade and led the way deeper into the floor. Kinro hesitated. "How did you throw me thus?" he asked. "No man I know has such strength." Orem looked over his shoulder at the smaller man. "I am Orem the Slayer." "Aye," Kinro said with a bow. and others call you Orem the Inheritor." Growling, Orem stalked into a low position into the corridor beyond. He was ready for a fight now. He had been blooded, and a primal rage simmered behind his gray eyes, driving him forward. There was a sour animal reek in the air, and something else, too. Unwashed man-flesh, foul and rank and corrupt. He smelled sorcery in the air. Pale light shone from further down the corridor, and he loped towards it. He heard nothing ahead, but was cautious and ready to strike as he slipped around the corner. Kinro followed close. The chamber within they found empty, save for a brass tripod of some sort, half as tall as Orem stood. Set in a crown at the very top of the device was a chunk of stone almost as large as his fist. It glowed with thin, steady light as they approached. "A morning flower," Kinro said. "I have read of these jewels. They are made in the Troikish mountain gardens." Orem did not read much. He had never heard of such a thing, and Kinro explained in quick, succinct sentences. Dwelling in places unlit by the sun except where their vast surface windows were built, the Troiks used morning flowers and other such spell-graven stones to illuminate their dark tunnels in the steaming depths of the earth. They glowed throughout the day, but brightest just before the dawn, signaling a change of day. "Though I know not what such a stone is doing so far from its home," Kinro said. "Why is it here, I wonder?" "Perhaps to summon our quarry back from prowling before dawn." Orem probed at it with his fingers. There was no heat despite the light. He picked it up. "Could use the light," he said to Kinro's questioning gaze. "They're with you, your ghosts, in your eyes. I can see them by the light of the morning flower. Who are they?" "I told you not to speak of them." "Very well," the smaller man said. "Now to find the creature." Evacuating the empty chamber, they caught sight of a curious pair of pale green eyes at the opposite end of the corridor. Twin lamps glimmered at them in the shadows just beyond a door that opened into the broken tower. "The cat!" Kinro hissed. He charged forward, sword out, straight before him. Orem, certain now that the cat was no fellow rogue, followed his companion, holding the morning flower aloft. Bouncing shadows jabbed left and right as they streaked down the stone stretch. The cat turned tail and fled into the ruined tower beyond. Though he was 30 paces away, Orem saw that it had been favoring a paw as it sprang into the dark. Orem skidded to a halt with his hand upon the jamb of the door. Kinro stood before him, and together they peered into the shaft of the tower. The morning flower's light revealed a narrow, winding set of stairs, barely broad enough for 2 men abreast. The steps were choked with stonework and debris, but most of this appeared to be shoved off to one side. Orem had expected it to be impassable, as was the door to the tower below. He grunted as he caught sight of the patchy violet depths of the pre-dawn vault above, littered with stardust. "Someone has cleared the path," Kinro whispered, starting forward.
"Best keep your blade awake and your tread light,"
Orem said,
down
following
into the
with
depths of
jab.
Brokewrist Tower, each man grimly measuring his mortality. Every step brought them closer to their doom, but neither balked nor uttered a word of complaint. The drawing winds of combat and fate wound about their ankles, driving them deeper beneath the broken tower. At last the stairs settled out across an uneven stone floor of rough, ancient cobbles. An arched portal lay ahead, its heavy timber door hung slightly ajar. Enough for a cat, no doubt. Bleeding, Orem put his head just beside the door, listening for the sounds of the chamber within. At first, there was nothing. He willed his heart to be still, for his very blood to stop as he probed with his senses. There. Faint but certain, padded footsteps, hurrying to and fro. Holding a hand up to Kinro, who stood ready, Orem eased the door back. His companion swept into the room on noiseless feet, half-crouched and ready to deal death on the instant. Orem followed, brave blade held in one hand and the morning flower in the other. The chamber was damp and cold. Water ran in thin rivulets down the brick walls, pooling where the floor was most uneven. The vaulted ceiling was just low enough to make Orem uncomfortable, but the more compact Kinro moved unobstructed. Ancient, unidentifiable rubble and ruck lay strewn about the walls, shelves or furniture or some such long abandoned and soon forgotten. The signs of recent occupation were undeniable, however. Scraps of cloth, half-burnt discarded candles, and the unmistakable smell of unwashed man and blood. Ahead, a thin light played below another wooden door. They crept closer, breathlessly, wolves prowling unwitting prey. The door was suddenly flung open, revealing a tall, thin man wearing a black tunic and breeches. Or perhaps not a man. Orem's keen eye resolved a distinct lack of facial features on the beast before him. In one instant he could have been a handsome man. A lick of shadow crossing his nose transformed him into a hideously scarred thug. Even the lines of his body seemed unsettled. It wore 2 bags slung over its shoulders, and a traveler's mantle with the hood thrown back. "Demon!" hissed Kinro, his feet sliding into a defender's stance.
You intrude on my home!
The thing shouted. Its voice was neither male nor female, nor old nor young. Its voice seemed to belong to no place or time, but flowed within the memory like water in the ear, aching and sweet. The thing stepped forward threateningly. It stood only 5 or 6 paces from the men now, holding long fingers that seemed to wind in the shadows like oily iron knives. Orem nodded at the bags on its shoulder.
Seems it won't be your home for long.
But I will leave it your grave. It lunged impossibly fast, raking out with ripping claws. Kinro caught this attack with a flashing parry, and the thing screeched as its fingers bearing Black Eagle's talons were severed. Blood splashed across the cobblestones. The creature barreled forward, trying to knock the small man aside. Kinro whirled aside, cutting again at its back with a swift return strike. But its momentum was not slowed. Onto Orem it rushed, who until that moment had been resting brave blade upon his shoulder and standing with the morning flower held at his waist. His confidence belied a deeper violence that unleashed itself at once, like a spring storm tearing down the arroyos of his western home. Driving back on one leg, he swept the blade down and buried it at the join of the creature's neck and shoulder. With the other hand, he smashed it in the face with the morning flower, a blow so powerful that it sent the beast sprawling, torn free of Orem's blade. A mortal creature would have been instantly felled by such a strike, but this thing was no creature of flesh and blood. Righting itself, the thing emitted a terrible scream, and thin, segmented legs of shadow erupted from its torso as its form melted and ran like vile tallow. It skittered towards the wall of the chamber, insectile and profane. Up it clambered, faster than Orem could spring after it, its arms breaking and resetting into vicious stinging barbs. What had only seconds ago seemed, generally, a man in form had become a writhing nightmare. Not a man, after all. From the ceiling it sprung at Orem again. It was heavier than it looked, and he had to drop the morning flower to catch it by its still human shoulders. The creature's man-like head suddenly became a bear's, roaring and snapping long black fangs nearly close enough to shred his face. Insane rage boiled in its small, widespread eyes as it strained at him. Legs burst out gouts of black blood along its sides, slashing at his unprotected forearms and clawing at his hair, neck, and shoulders.
Abomination!
He barked, straining against its malicious grip. His corded muscles stood out harshly against his long bones as he fought, forging it back inch by inch even as it tore at him. Finally, the demon's hold broke and he slammed it into the ground. Seeing his opportunity, Kinro set about it at once, slicing and slashing at limbs that faded to smoke when severed. Kinro drove it away from Orem, who had involuntarily recoiled, patting at his bleeding head where chunks of hair had been torn loose. Still it skittered about, sprouting more misbegotten limbs, taloned feet, and worse, while protecting its head and striking at Kinro with arms or pincers or writhing, boneless limbs that appeared as fast as they could be cut asunder. Kinro was faster yet, staying just out of reach as he laid about with his curved sword, steadily forcing it backwards towards the room it had burst from. Orem hated creatures of sorcery. Born from the western tribes, where the kings were still honorable and the myths truer to the past than not, he had been steeped in the lore of fell creatures and unholy nightmares that yet prowled the verge of man's domain. He knew that things like this could carry off a man's soul to the hells and deny him the just rewards for an honorable death. The Lion-born would slave for no demon, in life or otherwise.
"By Fustenustir!"
he thundered, storming back into the melee. The oath changed something about the space, charged it in some way that made Kinro stumble. The shadows grew long, the stone sharper. Power surged into the vaulted chamber, and Orem brought Brave Blade up above his head to deliver a killing stroke. Light emanated from the ring on his finger like lightning forged into white gold.
Orem the Inheritor,
the demon cawed, its head twisting around to face him. The voice was painfully familiar, his father's own, a voice long dead in lands far away. His heart ached to hear that voice. He had yearned for it over long years. "Spare me, my lad. I will tell you a secret, one I should have told you before you killed us." Orem brought the sword down with all the force in his iron arms. He cut through the wavering, shadowy defenses and split the skull of the dread beast. So powerful was this blow that it tore the creature in half, and Brave Blade skittered bloody sparks across the cobbles below. Then the chamber was silent, save for Kinro's panting. Orem was too tight to breathe, every ounce of his resolution holding firm until he was sure the enemy was dead. The air seemed to return to the room. Both men stood heaving, collecting their wits. "I did not think we could kill it," Kinro said at last.
"Everything dies."
"Even the beasts that crawl out of the hells?" Kinro shook his head in wonder. He flicked blood from his blade with practiced grace and sheathed it. What could have it known?
"Nothing that would bring back the dead. Nothing that would have absolved the damned,"
Orem growled. He wiped his sword off on a scrap of cloth draped over a nearby stone. "It was a demon, then," Kinro said.
"Who cares? Check that room beyond. Perhaps there's someone yet alive to rescue, or some sign of its origin."
He crouched beside the corpse and watched it fade to smoke. Eventually he bandaged his dripping wounds.